the thinkers who unlocked the cosmos. In ancient Greece, their scrolls revealed a mystery, still unsolved. Did you know that over 2,600 years ago, three men forever changed how humanity understands the universe? While the entire world explained earthquakes as the wrath of the god Poseidon and lightning as Zeus's weapons, they dared to seek answers in nature itself. Their names were Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. What they discovered not only challenged the gods, but laid the foundation for all modern scientific thought. But there's something these ancient scrolls reveal, something current scholars still debate with fervor. What secret did these first philosophers hold? And why does their mystery remain unsolved after more than 2 millennia? Imagine for a moment a city where every natural phenomenon had a divine explanation, where thunder was Zeus's angry voice, where storms at sea meant Poseidon was furious, and where every harvest depended on the whimsical mood of Demeter. This was Miletus, a prosperous commercial city on the coast of what we now know as Turkey in the 7th century before Christ. Miletus was no ordinary city. It was the beating heart of trade in the eastern Mediterranean, a place where cultures mixed, where merchants came from Egypt, Babylonia, Phoenicia. Its streets bustled with activity, fishermen returning with full nets, artisans working bronze and pottery, slaves carrying amphoras of olive oil. The aroma of freshly baked bread mixed with sea salt and occasionally with the sweet smoke of temple sacrifices. Because yes, temples dominated Miletus's urban landscape, imposing structures dedicated to the Olympian gods, where citizens went daily to offer libations, burn incense, and beg for good harvests or the safe return of loved ones sailing dangerous seas. Religion wasn't just part of life, it was life itself. The Milesians, like all Greeks of their era, lived in a completely animated universe. Every river had its nymph, every forest its protective god, every mountain its particular deity. There was no distinction between the natural and supernatural. Everything was interconnected in a great network of divine forces that could be benevolent or terrible, depending on their mood. But in this city of myths and rituals, something extraordinary was about to happen. Curious minds began to emerge, men who weren't satisfied with traditional answers. Merchants who had traveled to distant lands and seen that other peoples had different explanations for the same phenomena. Thinkers who wondered, if the Babylonians say earthquakes are caused by their god Marduk, and we say it's Poseidon, who's right? Or maybe there's another explanation? Exposure to different cultures had done something unthinkable to the Greek mentality. It had planted the seed of doubt. And when doubt takes root in a brilliant mind, extraordinary things happen. It was in this atmosphere of intellectual ferment that the first philosopher of the West was born. A man who dared to ask the question that would change everything. What if the gods weren't the answer? His name was Thales of Miletus, and what he was about to propose was so radical, so revolutionary, that many of his contemporaries thought he had lost his mind. But Thales had something few possessed in his era, the courage to doubt everything taken for granted. Legend tells that Thales was so absorbed in his thoughts, so fascinated by the cosmos's mysteries, that one night while walking and gazing at the stars, he fell into a well. A Thracian servant who witnessed the accident mocked him, saying, "How do you expect to know heaven's secrets if you can't even see what's under your feet?" But Thales wasn't a dreamer disconnected from reality. He was a deeply practical man, a successful merchant, someone who understood the material world better than most. And precisely because of this, his proposal was so revolutionary. While observing life in Miletus, Thales noticed something that escaped others. Water was everywhere. Human beings were largely composed of water. Plants needed water to grow. Animals died without water. Even seeds, the very basis of life, were moist. And not only that, water could transform. It could be liquid, solid like ice, or invisible like vapor. Then Thales did something no one had done before. Instead of saying, "Poseidon controls the waters," he said something completely different. "Everything comes from water." Do you realize what this meant? Thales was saying we didn't need gods to explain the universe, that there was a natural, observable principle that could account for all reality. He was proposing that the cosmos had a rational order that human beings could understand. His fellow citizens looked at him with a mixture of fascination and horror. How could a single element, water, give rise to everything that existed? How to explain fire, earth, air? How to explain nature's infinite diversity from a single substance? But Thales had answers. He observed how earth formed when water evaporated, leaving sediment. He saw how heat could generate vapor, and how vapor could condense back into water. He proposed that earth itself floated on an infinite primordial ocean, and that earthquakes weren't the result of divine wrath, but of fluctuations in those underground waters. For the first time in Western history, someone had replaced a mythical explanation with a natural theory. The change from mythos to logos had begun, but the story doesn't end with Thales. Because in Miletus there were other brilliant minds, and not all agreed with the founder of philosophy. One of those minds belonged to a younger man, probably a disciple of Thales, named Anaximander. And Anaximander had a fundamental objection to his master's theory. If everything comes from water, Anaximander wondered, how do we explain fire? How can water, which is cold and wet, give rise to something so opposite like flames? And what about drought? If water is the principle of everything, what explains the absence of water? Anaximander realized that any specific element would have these contradictions. If everything came from fire, how to explain ice? If everything came from earth, how to explain wind? He needed something different, something that wasn't any of the known elements, but could give rise to all of them. And then Anaximander proposed something truly extraordinary, something that even today we cannot completely visualize, the Apeiron. The Greek word means the unlimited, the indefinite, that which has no boundaries. Imagine trying to explain this to a Milesian of the 6th century BC. Anaximander was saying that at the origin of everything, there wasn't water, fire, earth, or air. There was something that couldn't be seen, touched, smelled, or defined. Something infinite, without limits, without specific characteristics, but with the potential to become anything. When something is indefinite, Anaximander argued, it has the potency to become anything definite. But Anaximander didn't stop with this abstract proposal. He also revolutionized our understanding of the cosmos in ways that leave us breathless even today. While most ancient civilizations imagined Earth as a flat surface supported by something, whether a giant turtle, pillars, or as Thales believed, floating on water, Anaximander proposed something radical. Earth wasn't supported by anything. It simply floated in space, maintaining its position because it was equidistant from everything else. Do you realize how revolutionary this was? Anaximander had intuited something that wouldn't be confirmed until thousands of years later, that Earth is an object in space, not a base upon which the universe is built. His ideas about celestial bodies were equally fascinating, though strange by our modern standards. He imagined the sun, moon, and stars not as spheres, but as giant wheels filled with fire, spinning around Earth, with holes through which light escaped. The stars were the closest wheels, with many small holes. The moon was a more distant wheel with a single hole. And the sun was the largest and most distant wheel, also with a single hole. It may sound strange, but consider this. Anaximander had correctly proposed that the sun was farther than the moon, that both were enormous masses composed mainly of fire, and that Earth floated freely in space. At a time when most believed the sun was simply Helios driving his chariot across the sky, these were extraordinarily sophisticated observations. But the most mysterious aspect of Anaximander's work is a quote that has been preserved through the centuries. It's the only phrase we have directly from him, and it has puzzled scholars for over 2,000 years. All things must in justice decline again toward that from which they had their origin. For they must give satisfaction and atonement for injustice, each in the order of time. What does this mean? Is he talking about a moral law governing the universe? About a cyclical process where everything returns to its origin? About the idea that existence itself is a kind of injustice that must be compensated? Philosophers still debate these questions. Some see in these words one of the first formulations of what we might call a universal natural law. Others find in them echoes of ideas that would appear centuries later in Buddhism and other Eastern philosophical traditions. What is certain is that Anaximander had introduced a deeply modern idea, that the universe operates according to impersonal, regular laws that can be understood by human reason. But in Miletus, there was a third thinker, and he had something to say about the theories of both Thales and Anaximander. Anaximenes had grown up listening to debates between Thales and Anaximander. He had reflected deeply on the problem of the first principle, the arche, that fundamental substance from which everything emerges. Thales's proposal seemed too limited to him. Anaximander's too abstract. How can something indefinable be the cause of something so specific and tangible as the world we see? He wondered. Anaximenes needed to find something that was concrete and observable, as Thales wanted, but that could also explain opposites, as Anaximander had pointed out, and then he had an epiphany. Air. At first glance, it might seem that Anaximenes was taking a step backward, returning to the simple elements that Anaximander had criticized. But Anaximenes had a unique perspective on air that made it the perfect candidate for the first principle. He observed that air completely surrounds us. We breathe air, we live submerged in it. When we look at the sky, we see an apparently infinite amount of air. But most importantly, Anaximenes realized that air could transform in ways that other elements couldn't. He developed a sophisticated theory of two fundamental processes, condensation and rarefaction. When air condensed, it became denser and colder, transforming first into wind, then into clouds, then into water, then into mud, and finally into stone and earth. When it rarefied, it became less dense and hotter, eventually becoming fire. Do you see the elegance of this theory? Anaximenes had found a way to explain all elements and all natural transformations through a single process, the change in air density. But there was something even deeper in his proposal. Anaximenes had introduced the concept that change was fundamental to existence. The universe wasn't static, it was a dynamic process of constant transformation. Everything was in flux, everything was changing, and that change followed predictable and rational patterns. Imagine the impact these ideas had in their time. For centuries, Greeks had lived in a world where change was capricious, where it depended on the gods' moods. Anaximenes was saying that change followed natural laws, that it could be understood and to some extent predicted. The three Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, had accomplished something extraordinary. They had taken a universe dominated by myths and transformed it into a rational cosmos. They had replaced the arbitrary will of gods with comprehensible natural laws. But more importantly, they had established a new way of investigating reality. It was no longer enough to accept traditional explanations. Now it was necessary to observe, question, propose theories, and be willing to change one's mind when better explanations emerged. They had invented what we today call the scientific method. However, there is something profoundly mysterious about what these three men accomplished, something that modern scholars are still trying to fully understand. How is it possible that in a small city, in the span of just a few decades, the fundamental ideas that would govern Western thought for the next 2,500 years emerged simultaneously? Was it coincidence? Was it the inevitable result of cultural exchange in a commercial port? Or was there something deeper, something in Miletus's air that facilitated this extraordinary intellectual awakening? Historians have proposed many theories. Some point to Miletus's economic prosperity, which freed some citizens from the daily struggle for survival and allowed them to dedicate themselves to contemplation. Others point to contact with different cultures, which would have relativized local beliefs and fostered skepticism. There are those who suggest that the political structure of Greek city-states more egalitarian than Eastern empires, created an environment where it was safer to question traditional authority. But perhaps the deepest answer is that these three men had discovered something about the very nature of the human mind. They had discovered that we have the capacity to transcend our instincts, our traditions, our fears, and seek truth through reason. They had discovered, in other words, that we are capable of philosophizing. The legacy of the Milesians is immense. Every time a scientist proposes a hypothesis, every time a researcher questions an established theory, every time someone prefers evidence to tradition, they are following the path these three men opened more than 2,600 years ago. But their legacy goes beyond science. The Milesians taught us something fundamental about how to live. They showed us that it is possible, and even necessary, to question beliefs that everyone takes for granted. That curiosity is more valuable than certainty. That changing one's mind when better evidence appears is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes didn't have telescopes or microscopes. They didn't have computers or laboratories. All they had was their ability to observe, think, and question. And with those simple tools, they achieved something that continues to resonate through the millennia. They transformed the way human beings understand their place in the cosmos. Today, when we look at the stars, when we wonder about the universe's origin, when we search for life on other planets, we are continuing the quest they began. When physicists talk about the Higgs boson as the particle that gives mass to everything else, they are seeking, in a certain way, their own arche, their own first principle. The question the Milesians left us remains relevant. What is the fundamental substance of reality? Is there something that unifies all the diversity we see around us? Perhaps the answer is energy, as Einstein suggests with his famous equation E=mc². Perhaps it's the vibrating strings of string theory. Perhaps it's something we haven't discovered yet. But what is certain is that we continue searching, continue questioning, continue marveling at the mystery of existence. And in that search, we carry with us the spirit of three men who, more than 2 millennia ago, dared to look beyond myths and find in nature itself the keys to understanding the cosmos. Their mystery is not yet completely solved, but perhaps that is the beauty of what they initiated, that the search for truth never ends, that there are always new questions to ask, new horizons to explore. In every scroll they wrote, in every idea they proposed, they left us the most precious gift, the conviction that the universe is comprehensible, that the human mind is capable of unraveling its secrets, and that the very search for truth is what makes us truly human. The cosmos they began to decipher continues to reveal its mysteries. And we, heirs to their curiosity and courage, continue their journey toward understanding.